She looked like any business traveler in 12F, quietly reading while sipping coffee. But when Captain Chin suddenly collapsed at 35,000 feet and First Officer Martinez's terrified voice declared, "Mayday," Harper Blackwood revealed her secret: 22 years of military test pilot experience that would save 147 lives today. Before you watch full story, comment below from which country are you watching. Don't forget to subscribe. It was a crisp Tuesday morning, October 17, 2024, when Delta Flight 292 prepared for departure from Seattle-Tacoma International Airport bound for Chicago O'Hare. The Boeing 737-800 was packed with the usual mix of business travelers, tourists, and families, all settling in for the 3.5-hour journey across the American Northwest. Among them sat Harper Blackwood, a woman in her early 40s wearing simple dark jeans, a comfortable gray sweater, and worn leather boots that suggested someone who traveled frequently but without pretense. She had claimed seat 12F, a window seat in the middle of the aircraft, and was quietly reading what appeared to be a paperback romance novel while other passengers stowed their carry-ons and found their seats. Nothing about Harper suggested she was anything other than another professional woman traveling for business, perhaps heading to a conference or client meeting in Chicago. Her auburn hair was pulled back in a practical ponytail. She wore minimal makeup that emphasized natural features weathered by years of sun and wind, and her only jewelry was a simple watch with a leather band and small silver earrings that looked like they had sentimental value rather than monetary worth. Her carry-on bag looked standard issue for frequent travelers, containing what appeared to be a laptop, some files, and the usual assortment of snacks and charging cables that experienced passengers always packed for cross-country flights. There was nothing flashy or attention-grabbing about her appearance, which was exactly how she preferred to travel these days. The flight attendants moved through the cabin with practiced efficiency, conducting their pre-flight safety demonstration and ensuring passengers were properly seated with seatbelts fastened and tray tables in their upright positions. When Amanda Rodriguez, a cheerful flight attendant with 5 years of experience and dreams of eventually becoming a pilot herself, paused by Harper's row to check seatbelts and overhead bin security, she offered the warm smile she gave to all passengers. "Good morning. Traveling to Chicago for business or pleasure?" she asked politely, genuinely interested in her passengers' lives during what she knew could be a stressful travel experience for many people. Harper looked up from her book with a friendly but reserved expression that suggested someone comfortable with social interaction but not particularly seeking it out. "Business, mostly," she replied in a voice that carried just a hint of authority, though Amanda didn't pick up on the subtle confidence that suggested someone accustomed to command situations and life-or-death decision-making. "Should be a smooth flight today." Her assessment of the weather conditions wasn't just casual conversation but came from years of reading meteorological data and understanding atmospheric patterns in ways that most people never learned. What Amanda and the other passengers couldn't possibly know was that Harper Blackwood was analyzing everything around her with the trained eye of someone who had spent over 22 years in military and commercial aviation. As the ground crew completed their pre-flight procedures outside her window, she mentally cataloged each step, noting the fuel truck's positioning, the efficiency of the baggage handlers, the thoroughness of the marshaleur signals, and the way the pilots conducted their exterior inspection of the aircraft. Her trained senses automatically assessed wind conditions by watching windsocks and observing how ground equipment moved, evaluated weather patterns by reading cloud formations and atmospheric pressure indicators, and monitored airport operations with the instinctive awareness that never left someone who had spent decades making life-and-death decisions in aircraft cockpits around the world. The businessman in the aisle seat, Thomas Mitchell from Spokane, was busy organizing his laptop and presentation materials for what he had mentioned was an important client meeting in Chicago. He glanced over at Harper occasionally, noting her calm demeanor and wondering what kind of business took someone from Seattle to Chicago on a Tuesday morning. Most of the other passengers around them seemed either nervous about flying or absorbed in their phones and tablets. But this woman had the kind of composed presence that suggested she spent a lot of time traveling and was completely comfortable with the process. Captain Robert Chin and First Officer Julie Martinez completed their extensive cockpit preparations in the flight deck, working through checklists that covered everything from fuel calculations to weather analysis to emergency procedures. Both were experienced pilots with excellent safety records, but neither had any idea that one of their passengers possessed more combined flight experience than both of them put together. Harper had logged over 18,000 hours as a military test pilot, airline captain, and emergency response aviator before retiring from active flying 3 years ago to pursue consulting work that kept her connected to aviation but allowed her to maintain a more predictable schedule. Her military career had been extraordinary even by the standards of elite aviation communities. She had started as a Navy pilot flying F/A-18 Hornets off aircraft carriers, where she had learned to make split-second decisions in conditions that would paralyze most people with fear. After proving herself in fleet squadrons, she had been selected for the Navy's elite test pilot program, where she had flown experimental aircraft under conditions that pushed both machines and human capabilities to their absolute limits. She had tested new flight control systems, evaluated advanced weapons platforms, and participated in classified programs that required security clearances most people never knew existed. After completing her military service with the rank of commander, Harper had transitioned to commercial aviation, where she had quickly earned captain status with a major airline. But even commercial flying hadn't satisfied her need for challenging aviation work, so she had also qualified as an emergency response aviator, flying rescue helicopters and specialized aircraft in conditions that regular pilots would never attempt. Hurricane evacuations, mountain rescues, medical emergencies in remote locations, forest fire suppression operations. If it required flying in impossible conditions to save lives, Harper had probably done it at some point during her distinguished career. At exactly 8:15 a.m. Pacific Time, Delta 292 pushed back from Gate A12 right on schedule, the powerful tugboat maneuvering the Boeing 737 away from the terminal with the precision that came from thousands of similar operations. As they began the taxi toward their assigned runway, Harper felt the familiar sensation she always experienced during the ground movement phase, not excitement or nervousness like typical passengers, but the deep analytical awareness of someone mentally monitoring every aspect of the aircraft's performance. Her paperback novel lay forgotten in her lap as she instinctively listened to engine harmonics, felt for any unusual vibrations through the airframe, and observed the pilot's taxi technique through subtle cues that most people would never notice or understand. The taxi to runway 16L took about 12 minutes due to moderate traffic at Seattle-Tacoma, giving Harper time to observe the airport operations around them. She watched other aircraft movements with the professional interest of someone who understood the complex choreography required to keep a major airport functioning safely. Ground control vectors, runway assignments, departure sequences, weather considerations, all of it was second nature to her, like a native language she had been speaking for over 2 decades. Thomas Mitchell tried to strike up a conversation as they waited in the departure queue behind 2 other aircraft. "Flying much these days?" he asked, noting Harper's complete calm while other passengers around them seemed more anxious about the impending takeoff. Many people, he had noticed over years of business travel, showed at least some signs of nervousness during taxi and takeoff, but this woman looked as relaxed as if she were sitting in her living room. "Some," Harper replied diplomatically, not mentioning that until 3 years ago she had been flying almost daily in various military and civilian aircraft, often in conditions that would give civilian passengers nightmares. "Chicago's a nice city if you've never been there." Thomas nodded and launched into a discussion about his sales territory and upcoming client presentations, completely oblivious to the fact that he was chatting with someone who had flown combat missions over hostile territory, test flights in experimental aircraft that existed nowhere else in the world, and emergency rescue operations in weather conditions that grounded every other aircraft in the region. At 8:27 a.m. Pacific Time, Flight 292 received their takeoff clearance from the tower controller. Harper felt the familiar surge of acceleration as Captain Chen advanced the throttles to takeoff power, the Boeing 737 CFM56 engines spooling up to produce the 24,500 pounds of thrust needed to lift the aircraft and its 147 passengers and crew members into the morning sky. The takeoff roll seemed routine to the passengers, but Harper was automatically monitoring engine sound, acceleration rate, rotation speed, and climb attitude with the ingrained habits that never left experienced aviators. They lifted off into the clear Seattle sky at 8:29 a.m., climbing steadily through 10,000 feet as the Pacific Northwest fell away below them. Harper pressed her face to the window, not with the wonder of a typical passenger seeing familiar sights from above, but with the practiced assessment of someone evaluating weather conditions, air traffic patterns, and the pilot's climb technique. She noted their rate of climb, about 2,000 feet per minute, which was appropriate for their weight and conditions, the smoothness of their turn toward the southeast as they followed their assigned departure route, and the professional way Captain Chen handled the Boeing 737's automated systems during the critical first few minutes of flight. The view from 15,000 feet was spectacular, with Mount Rainier visible to the south and the Cascade Range stretching endlessly toward the horizon. Other passengers were taking photos and pointing out landmarks, but Harper was reading the sky itself, cloud formations that indicated atmospheric stability, wind patterns visible in the movement of smoke from distant fires, weather systems developing over the mountains that might affect flights later in the day. It was the kind of comprehensive situational awareness that had kept her alive through decades of dangerous flying, and old habits died hard even in the relatively safe environment of commercial aviation. The flight attendants began their beverage service as they reached their assigned cruising altitude of 35,000 feet, the aircraft settling into the smooth, stable flight that passengers expected on clear weather days. Amanda Rodriguez moved through the cabin with her cart, offering the drinks and snacks that helped pass time during the 3.5-hour journey across the northwestern United States. When she reached Harper's Row, she still had no idea she was serving someone whose aviation credentials exceeded those of most airline captains. "What can I get you to drink this morning?" Amanda asked with the practiced cheerfulness that came from years of customer service training, though she genuinely enjoyed interacting with passengers and making their travel experience as pleasant as possible. "Just coffee black, please," Harper replied, accepting the small plastic cup with a quiet "thank you" that impressed Amanda with its genuine politeness and consideration. So many passengers these days barely acknowledge the crew's existence, treating flight attendants like invisible servants. But this woman had the kind of respectful manner that suggested good breeding and professional experience dealing with service personnel in high-stress situations. If Amanda had known the truth about Harper's background, she would have understood that the courteous behavior toward crew members came from years of commanding flight crews herself, where mutual respect and clear communication meant the difference between mission success and catastrophic failure. Harper had always treated her own crews with the same professional courtesy she now showed to the flight attendants, understanding from hard experience that every person aboard an aircraft played a crucial role in ensuring everyone's safety, and that the best leaders led by example in both critical situations and routine operations. As they settled into the cruise portion of their flight, crossing from Washington into Idaho airspace, Harper allowed herself to relax slightly and return to her book. The novel was actually a carefully disguised technical manual on advanced flight systems and emergency procedures, something she had learned to camouflage during her commercial flying days when passengers would sometimes recognize her and want to discuss aviation topics she preferred to keep private during her off-duty travel. She had developed an entire collection of book covers that made highly technical aviation materials look like popular fiction, allowing her to continue her professional education without attracting unwanted attention from curious fellow travelers. The manual she was currently reading discussed emergency procedures for multiple engine failures, pilot incapacitation scenarios, and advanced techniques for handling aircraft in extreme weather conditions, topics she hoped never to need again but continued studying out of professional habit and the deep-seated belief that knowledge could save lives in unexpected situations. Even in retirement, she maintained currency in emergency procedures across multiple aircraft types, partly out of professional pride and partly because she had seen too many situations where someone's life depended on having the right knowledge at the right moment. 2 hours into the flight, as they crossed into Montana airspace over some of the most rugged terrain in North America, Harper was deep in a chapter about crew resource management during medical emergencies when she noticed something that made her professional instincts kick into high alert. The aircraft's flight path had become subtly irregular, with small deviations in heading and altitude that most passengers would never notice but that suggested to her experienced eye that something in the cockpit wasn't quite right. Captain Chin was feeling increasingly unwell as they approached the halfway point of their journey, though he was trying to dismiss his symptoms as the result of an early morning departure, too much coffee during his pre-flight briefing, and the stress of managing a full passenger load during busy airspace. The mild headache he had been experiencing since takeoff was getting worse, and he was beginning to feel slightly nauseous and short of breath. His first officer, Julie Martinez, was focused on her instrument readings and routine radio communications with air traffic control centers as they were handed off from one controller to another, and she hadn't yet noticed her captain's increasing discomfort. Martinez was an experienced pilot herself, with over 8,000 flight hours and an excellent safety record, but she had never faced a situation where her captain became incapacitated during flight. Her training had covered such scenarios in the simulator, but like most commercial pilots, she hoped never to face that particular emergency in real life. She was concentrating on the routine aspects of cross-country flying, monitoring weather ahead, coordinating with air traffic control, managing fuel consumption, and maintaining the smooth, professional operation that passengers expected from their airline crews. Harper, however, was noticing things that the first officer hadn't picked up on yet. Her trained senses, honed by decades of flying with various crew members in both military and civilian environments, were detecting the subtle changes that indicated all was not well in the cockpit. The aircraft was still flying safely and within normal parameters, but she could feel the small corrections in heading and altitude that suggested the pilots were having to work harder than usual to maintain their assigned flight path. It was the kind of situational awareness that had kept her alive through countless dangerous situations, and even as a passenger she couldn't turn off the threat assessment systems that had become second nature over the years. She closed her disguised manual and began paying closer attention to the aircraft's behavior, her analytical mind automatically shifting into the diagnostic mode that had served her so well during her active flying career. The Boeing 737 was still performing normally by commercial aviation standards, but her military trained senses were picking up anomalies that suggested something was developing that might require intervention. She had learned long ago that small problems in aviation had a tendency to become big problems very quickly if they weren't addressed promptly and professionally. At 10:43 a.m. Mountain Time, as Flight 292 flew over Billings, Montana, at 35,000 feet above some of the most remote and challenging terrain in the continental United States, Captain Robert Chin suddenly felt a sharp, crushing pain in his chest that took his breath away and sent waves of agony down his left arm. He tried to dismiss it as severe indigestion from his hurried breakfast at the hotel that morning, but the pain intensified rapidly, spreading across his chest in the classic pattern that his aviation medical training had taught him to recognize as a possible heart attack. "Julie," he said quietly to his first officer, his voice tight with growing alarm and the effort required to speak through the increasing pain, "I think I'm having some kind of medical issue here. Chest pain getting worse." Martinez looked over at her captain with immediate concern, noting the sweat that was suddenly beading on his forehead despite the cool temperature in the cockpit, his labored breathing, and the way he was clutching his left arm. She had never seen Captain Chin look anything other than completely professional and in control, but now he appeared to be in genuine distress. First Officer Martinez had been flying as a commercial pilot for 8 years and had built her career on being thoroughly prepared for any situation that might arise during flight operations, but she had never actually faced a scenario where her captain became incapacitated during flight. She had practiced such emergencies extensively in the flight simulator during her recurrent training, working through the procedures for assuming command of the aircraft and coordinating with air traffic control and cabin crew. But the reality of having it happen at 35,000 feet over remote Montana wilderness was far more terrifying than any simulation had prepared her for. "What kind of medical issue?" she asked, trying to keep her voice steady and professional while her mind raced through the emergency procedures she had memorized but hoped never to use in real life. "How can I help?" Even as she spoke, she was scanning the instrument panel to ensure their flight path remained stable and safe, taking over the primary flying duties while trying to assess the severity of her captain's condition and determine what actions needed to be taken to protect the safety of their 147 passengers and crew members. "Severe chest pain, shortness of breath, pain radiating down my left arm," Chin managed to say, his training allowing him to provide the clinical details that would help his crew understand the seriousness of the situation even as the pain made it difficult to concentrate or think clearly. I think this might be." Before he could finish the sentence, his eyes rolled back and he slumped forward in his seat, unconscious and unresponsive. Martinez stared at her captain in shock for several precious seconds, her mind struggling to process the fact that she was now solely responsible for safely operating a Boeing 737 with 147 people aboard while flying over some of the most remote and challenging terrain in North America. The magnitude of the responsibility hit her like a physical blow. Every decision she made from this moment forward would determine whether those 147 people made it home to their families or became casualties of an aviation disaster that would be investigated for years to come. Her training kicked in after those first few seconds of shock, and she immediately took positive control of the aircraft, ensuring their flight path remained stable and safe while she processed the emergency situation and began implementing the procedures she had practiced so many times in the simulator. She checked Captain Chen's pulse and breathing, both were present but weak, then reached for her radio with hands that were already beginning to shake from the stress and adrenaline of suddenly being in command during a life-threatening emergency. "Mayday, Mayday, Mayday," Martinez called over the emergency frequency, her voice professional and clear despite the terror she felt inside as she spoke the words that would alert every air traffic control facility and emergency response agency within hundreds of miles that Delta Flight 292 was in serious trouble. "Minneapolis Center, Delta 292 Heavy declaring medical emergency. Captain is unconscious, appears to be cardiac event. First officer assuming command of aircraft. Request immediate priority handling and medical assistance." The words seemed to hang in the air of the cockpit, making the crisis suddenly, terrifyingly real in a way that all her simulator training had never quite captured. This wasn't practice anymore. This was 147 real people depending on her ability to handle an emergency that exceeded anything she had ever faced in her 8 years of commercial flying. The weight of that responsibility was almost overwhelming, and she had to consciously fight down the panic that threatened to cloud her judgment when clear thinking was most essential. The effect of the Mayday call rippled immediately through air traffic control centers across the northwestern United States as controllers recognized the seriousness of the situation and began implementing emergency response procedures. Minneapolis Center, which was handling Delta 292's flight following at the time of the emergency, immediately cleared all traffic away from the aircraft's current position and future flight path, giving Martinez complete priority in the busy airspace over Montana and preparing to coordinate whatever assistance might be needed. Delta 292, Minneapolis Center copies your Mayday. The controller responded with the calm professionalism that air traffic controllers brought to emergency situations, though everyone in the facility understood the gravity of what they were dealing with. We're clearing traffic around you now and coordinating emergency response. What are your current intentions and requirements? The controller was already working with supervisors and coordinators to alert medical personnel, emergency response teams, airline dispatch, and company maintenance about the developing situation. In the passenger cabin, people were beginning to notice that something unusual was happening when flight attendants started moving through the aisles with obvious urgency, whispering among themselves with expressions of concern that contrasted sharply with their usual professional calm and friendly demeanor. Amanda Rodriguez and her fellow crew members had been trained to handle various emergencies, but a pilot incapacitation during flight was one of the most serious scenarios they could face, requiring coordination between cabin and cockpit crews that they had practiced but hoped never to experience. The intercom crackled to life as First Officer Martinez's voice filled the passenger cabin, and even passengers who didn't usually pay attention to pilot announcements could hear the tension and stress that she was working hard to control. Ladies and gentlemen, this is First Officer Martinez from the cockpit. We're experiencing a medical emergency with one of our crew members and will need to divert to the nearest suitable airport as quickly as possible. Please remain seated with your seatbelts securely fastened while we coordinate our emergency response with air traffic control and ground personnel. The announcement sent an immediate wave of anxiety through the passenger cabin as people realized their routine flight had suddenly become something much more dangerous and uncertain. Conversations stopped. Phones came out as passengers tried to send messages to family members, and the nervous energy that always accompanied the realization that a flight was in trouble began spreading through the cabin like wildfire. Parents pulled their children closer, business travelers stopped working on their laptops, and everyone began looking around with the wide-eyed concern of people who understood they were in a situation beyond their control. Thomas Mitchell turned to Harper with fear clearly visible in his eyes, his earlier confidence about his Chicago business meetings forgotten in the face of a potential aviation emergency. A medical emergency? What does that mean exactly? Are we going to be okay? Should I be worried? His voice carried the barely controlled panic that Harper had seen in countless people when they realized their lives might be in danger, and she could see the same fear beginning to spread among the other passengers around them. Harper studied his frightened expression and the growing anxiety of the passengers nearby, seeing the familiar pattern of panic that she had witnessed in numerous emergency situations throughout her career. She understood that fear was contagious in confined spaces like aircraft cabins, and that someone needed to project calm and confidence to prevent the situation from deteriorating into chaos that would make everyone's job more difficult. Her training and experience had taught her that leadership was most important when people were at their most vulnerable. "It means one of the pilots is having health problems," Harper said calmly, her voice carrying a reassuring authority that made Thomas and several other nearby passengers focus on her words rather than their fear. "The first officer is fully qualified and trained to handle the aircraft by herself if necessary. We're going to be fine." What she didn't tell him was that she could hear the stress and relative inexperience in Martinez's voice, could sense from the aircraft's slightly erratic flight path that the remaining pilot was struggling with the overwhelming responsibility of managing both the medical crisis and complex flight operations simultaneously. Her professional assessment of the situation was that while Martinez was clearly competent and following proper procedures, she was also obviously overwhelmed by the magnitude of her responsibilities and would benefit greatly from experienced assistance if any were available. Harper had been in similar situations during her military career, where sudden emergencies had required junior personnel to step up and handle responsibilities far beyond their normal experience level, and she knew that having a calm, experienced voice providing guidance could make the difference between success and disaster. Amanda Rodriguez rushed down the aisle toward the cockpit, her earlier cheerfulness completely replaced by professional urgency as she prepared to assist with whatever medical emergency was unfolding in the flight deck. As she passed Harper's row, moving with the quick, purposeful stride of someone responding to a crisis, their eyes met for a moment, and Amanda was struck by the complete calm and composure she saw in the passenger's expression. While everyone else in the cabin was showing obvious signs of stress, anxiety, or outright panic, this woman looked as composed and analytical as if she were still reading her romance novel. Harper made a decision that would change everything about Delta Flight 292's emergency. She unbuckled her seatbelt and stood up with the smooth, confident movement of someone accustomed to taking action in crisis situations, causing Thomas and several other passengers in nearby rows to look at her with surprise and confusion. In an emergency situation, passengers were supposed to remain seated and let the crew handle everything, but something about this woman's demeanor suggested she was not like other passengers. "Ma'am, please remain seated with your seatbelt fastened," Amanda called out as she noticed Harper moving toward the front of the aircraft, her training dictating that all passengers needed to stay in their assigned seats during emergency situations to avoid interfering with crew operations or creating additional hazards. "We need everyone to stay in their seats during this emergency so our crew can work effectively." "Actually, you need someone who knows how to help," Harper replied, her voice carrying an unmistakable tone of authority and confidence that made Amanda stop in her tracks and really look at her for the first time since the flight had begun. There was something in the woman's bearing, her calm demeanor, and the way she spoke that suggested this wasn't just another panicked passenger making unrealistic claims about her abilities during a crisis situation. "I'm a pilot," Harper continued, her voice steady and professional in a way that immediately commanded Amanda's attention and respect. "A very experienced pilot with extensive emergency response training. And unless I'm very much mistaken, that first officer is going to need assistance that your crew can't provide, no matter how well-trained and professional you are." The authority in her voice was unmistakable, carrying the weight of someone who had commanded aircraft and crews in life-threatening situations many times before. Amanda stared at her, processing this unexpected revelation while her mind raced through the implications. The composed passenger she had been serving coffee and making small talk with just an hour earlier was claiming to be a pilot? Not just any pilot, but someone with extensive emergency response experience? "What kind of pilot?" she asked, though something in Harper's demeanor and the way she had assessed the emergency situation was already convincing her that this woman was exactly what she claimed to be. 22 years of military and commercial aviation experience, Harper said simply, not elaborating on the classified missions, experimental aircraft testing, or combat operations that had comprised much of her distinguished career. "Test pilot, airline captain, emergency response specialist. I've handled situations like this before, including pilot incapacitation scenarios in much more challenging conditions than we're facing today." She didn't mention the time she had brought damaged military aircraft home with wounded or unconscious crew members, or the civilian emergencies where she had assumed command of aircraft whose regular crews were unable to continue operating. "Right now, that first officer needs help from someone who understands emergency aviation operations at a level beyond standard commercial procedures," Harper continued, her analysis of Martinez's radio communications and the aircraft's flight behavior telling her that time was critical. "I'm probably the most qualified person on this aircraft to provide that assistance, and every minute we delay is a minute that could make the difference between a successful emergency landing and something much worse." Amanda's extensive customer service training told her to keep passengers in their seats and follow established protocols, but her instincts and common sense told her that this woman was exactly what she claimed to be and could provide the kind of expert assistance that the crisis demanded. There was something about Harper's calm confidence, her professional bearing, her obvious knowledge of aviation procedures, and the way she had immediately recognized and analyzed the emergency situation that convinced Amanda she was telling the truth about her background and capabilities. "Follow me," Amanda said without further hesitation, making an executive decision that her supervisors would either commend or criticize depending on how the situation developed, but knowing instinctively that this was the right choice under the circumstances. She led Harper toward the cockpit, moving quickly but carefully through the cabin where other passengers watched with curiosity and concern, wondering who this calm woman was and why she was being allowed to approach the flight deck during an emergency. The flight deck of Delta Flight 292 was a scene of controlled chaos when Harper entered, her experienced eyes immediately taking in the situation and beginning the threat assessment process that had become second nature during her decades of emergency aviation operations. Captain Chin was slumped unconscious in his seat, his breathing shallow but regular, while First Officer Martinez struggled to maintain aircraft control, communicate with multiple air traffic control centers, monitor the captain's medical condition and coordinate with the cabin crew all at the same time, a workload that would challenge even the most experienced pilots under the best of circumstances. Martinez's hands were visibly shaking from stress and the adrenaline surge that came with being solely responsible for the lives of 147 people during an unprecedented emergency, and Harper could see that the first officer was approaching the limits of her ability to handle the multiple tasks that the crisis demanded. Her voice over the radio was becoming increasingly strained, her flight path was showing small but noticeable deviations from optimal parameters, and she was showing the classic signs of task saturation that Harper had seen in numerous pilots during her years of training and evaluating aviators under stress. "First Officer Martinez," Harper said, her voice calm and professional as she stepped into the cockpit and immediately established her presence and authority without being overwhelming or threatening. "I'm Captain Harper Blackwood, retired military and commercial aviation. I'm here to assist with your emergency." Martinez looked up at her with an expression that combined desperation, hope, and profound relief at seeing someone who obviously knew what they were doing and could provide the expert help she desperately needed. In military and commercial pilot culture, rank and experience mattered enormously, and even though Harper was retired from active flying, her calm presence, obvious expertise, and professional bearing immediately established her authority in the crisis situation. Martinez could hear the confidence and competence in Harper's voice, could see the way she moved and assessed the cockpit environment, and could sense that this was someone who had handled similar emergencies many times before and knew exactly what needed to be done. "Thank God you're here," Martinez said, her voice tight with relief at no longer being alone with the overwhelming responsibility of managing an emergency that exceeded her training and experience. "Captain Chin collapsed about 15 minutes ago, looks like a heart attack or cardiac event. I've declared Mayday and we're coordinating with air traffic control, but I'm not sure I can handle all of this by myself. There are so many things to monitor and coordinate, and I've never actually dealt with pilot incapacitation in real life." Harper quickly assessed the situation with the systematic approach that had served her well through countless emergencies, her trained eyes scanning the instrument panel to understand their current position, altitude, heading, fuel status, and aircraft system status while simultaneously evaluating the unconscious captain's condition and the first officer's stress level. She could see that Martinez was following proper procedures but was becoming overwhelmed by the sheer volume of tasks that needed to be managed simultaneously during a complex emergency. "You're doing exactly what you should be doing," Harper said reassuringly, her calm tone and obvious competence already beginning to reduce Martinez's stress level as she realized she now had experienced help to manage the crisis. "You declared the emergency properly, you're maintaining aircraft control, and you're coordinating with air traffic control. Those are the three most important things. Now let's get organized and work through this systematically." Harper slid into the jump seat behind the pilots, immediately assuming the role of emergency coordinator while allowing Martinez to maintain her position as pilot in command, which was important both for legal reasons and for Martinez's confidence. "What's your planned diversion airport?" she asked, noting from the instrument displays that they were currently over south-central Montana and would need to choose an airport with adequate runway length, emergency response capabilities, and medical facilities for Captain Chin. Martinez consulted her charts and airport directory with hands that were already steadying now that experienced help had arrived to share the enormous responsibility she had been carrying alone. "I was thinking Billings Logan International," she said. "It's the nearest airport with runways long enough for our current weight, and they have full emergency response capabilities including medical facilities." Harper nodded approvingly, her assessment agreeing with Martinez's choice. "Excellent decision. That's exactly where I would have gone. What's your current fuel status and estimated time to arrival?" As Martinez provided the requested information, Harper was already working through the mental calculations that would determine their approach and landing parameters, taking into account their current weight, expected weather conditions at Billings, runway conditions, and the emergency response coordination that would be required. Her years of emergency aviation experience were taking over, providing the systematic thinking and comprehensive planning that the stressed first officer desperately needed to supplement her own capabilities. "Minneapolis Center, Delta 292, Harper said, taking over radio communications to free up Martinez to focus entirely on flying the aircraft safely, which was the most critical task during any emergency situation. "We now have additional qualified pilot assistance in the cockpit. Requesting direct routing to Billings Logan International and coordination with airport emergency response teams. We'll need full emergency equipment including medical response for our incapacitated crew member." The air traffic controller's voice came back immediately, and Harper could hear the relief in his tone as he recognized that Delta 292 now had experienced emergency response coordination. Delta 292 Minneapolis Center copies. We show additional pilot assistance. We're coordinating full emergency response at Billings Logan International and clearing you direct with priority handling. Emergency equipment will be standing by on runway 10R. Harper's calm, professional voice over the radio frequency had an immediate calming effect on everyone involved in the emergency response coordination. Controllers, supervisors, and emergency response personnel could recognize the voice of someone who knew exactly what she was doing and had handled similar situations before, and their own stress levels decreased accordingly as they realized the aircraft now had the expert assistance needed to manage the complex emergency successfully. In the passenger cabin, word was spreading quickly that someone had gone forward to help in the cockpit, and the mood was beginning to shift from panic toward cautious optimism. Thomas Mitchell and the other passengers around Harper's empty seat were discussing this development with growing hope and curiosity. She said she was a pilot when I asked her about flying, Thomas told anyone who would listen, his earlier fear beginning to give way to relief. She seemed to know what she was talking about, very calm and confident. The flight attendants were also spreading word throughout the cabin that they now had assistance from a qualified pilot, which helped significantly in reducing the panic and anxiety that had been building among the 147 passengers. Amanda Rodriguez was particularly vocal in her reassurance, having seen Harper's professional demeanor and obvious competence firsthand. We have an experienced pilot helping our crew, she announced to passengers in her section. Someone with extensive emergency training who knows exactly how to handle this situation. Back in the cockpit, Harper was systematically working through the emergency checklist while Martinez maintained aircraft control and coordinated with air traffic control centers as they were handed off from one controller to another during their diversion toward Billings. First officer, let's start our descent toward Billings, Harper instructed, her voice carrying the calm authority that came from years of command experience. Request flight level 280 initially, and reduce speed to 280 knots. That will give us more time to coordinate our approach and ensure we have everything properly configured for landing. Martinez immediately complied with Harper's instructions, her confidence growing with each clear, logical direction from the experienced captain. The overwhelming sense of being alone with impossible responsibilities was lifting as she realized she now had someone with far more emergency experience than her own guiding the situation toward a successful resolution. Descending to flight level 280, reducing speed to 280 knots. She confirmed, making the appropriate control inputs while Harper monitored the aircraft's response and continued coordinating with air traffic control. What about Captain Chin? Martinez asked, glancing at her unconscious colleague with obvious concern for his welfare and worry about his chances of recovery. Harper had been continuously monitoring the captain's condition while managing the flight emergency, using the basic medical training that all military pilots received during their careers. His breathing is regular and his pulse is steady, she reported, checking Chen's vital signs again. Color is improving slightly, which suggests he's stable for now, but he definitely needs immediate medical attention once we're on the ground. Harper's assessment was based on extensive experience with medical emergencies during military operations, where pilots often had to provide basic medical care for injured crew members or passengers during flights to medical facilities. She had dealt with everything from combat injuries,